Having gotten halfway through our list of some of the hardest areas in FromSoftware Soulsborne titles and Sekiro, in part 2 we'll be looking at the remaining 15. A little reminder before we pick things up again. This entire list is covering Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Without further ado, let's get back into it. Tower of LATRIA, Demon Souls. In many ways quite similar to Irithyll Dungeon in Dark Souls 3, Tower of LATRIA was one of the first tastes Soulsborne fans got of how creepy and atmospheric this meta-series could be. Even beyond that atmosphere though, this is not an easy place to get through. With enemies that use effective and dangerous ranged attacks, enemies that can poison you, those creepy mind flayers, airborne gargoyles, and much more. There's plenty in Tower of LATRIA that can send you to an untimely death. SEN'S Fortress, Dark Souls. Armed with the knowledge of previous playthroughs, experienced Souls players might actually find SEN'S Fortress much easier now. But going through the game for the first time, this area was hard. Traps, tricky platforming sections, a pit at the bottom where movement is restricted and enemies can beat you to a pulp, mazy designed, fast-moving lizard enemies. It's like a checklist of all the Dark Souls tropes, and it makes use of all of them excellently. yahar'gul, Bloodborne. Even if you put aside its discomforting lore and the creepy art design, yahar'gul Unseen Village still has a lot of challenging stuff that can make you sweat. There's the respawning enemies, their tricky placement, those giant laser beams shooting amygdala, not to mention the fact that roughly halfway through, you're also thrown into a fight against 3 hunters, one of the hardest enemy types in the entire game, at the same time. Shrine of Storms, Demon Souls. A classic case of high risk, high reward, Shrine of Storms is among the more challenging areas you'll visit in Demon Souls, which is saying something. As is the case with many areas we've mentioned so far in this feature, Shrine of Storms has some risky poison-based areas, while enemies with strong physical attacks and ranged weapons can also be found aplenty. Then there are those incredibly agile skeletons and those spike-throwing manta rays, while particular parts of this area are also restricting your movement by making you traverse treacherous, narrow ledges. Demon Ruins, Dark Souls. You need to juggle plenty of challenging things in the Demon Ruins. There's pools of lava, there's a lot of really tough enemies who can be a pain to deal with, especially since a couple of them are actually previously proper bosses. There's 3 separate boss fights to tackle, not to mention the fact that you need to Lord Vessel to be able to open the Golden Frog Gate. Nightmare of MENSIS, Bloodborne. Bloodborne's Nightmare of MENSIS lives up to its name, except it's nightmare of every single Bloodborne player in truth, or most of us at any rate. Tricky and at times unfair enemy placement is something this area shares with the previously mentioned yahar'gul. The fact that there's plenty of enemies that can give you the frenzy status effect makes everything that much trickier. Fountainhead Palace, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. One of the final areas in the game, players get to visit Fountainhead Palace if they choose to side with Lord Kuro against the Owl, and what a visit it is. While the entire area is large and full of the typically hard-as-nails enemies and encounters the entire game is littered with, one particular boss fight makes it one of the hardest areas in the entire game, and that fight is against True Corrupted Monk. Armed with 3 health bars and immune to divine confetti, this is a tricky fight to get through, though at least you do get some stealth death blows from above to make things a little easier. Undead BURG, Dark Souls. With the benefit of hindsight, Undead BURG isn't too hard to get through. It was one of the first areas you accessed in Dark Souls after all. But like a few others mentioned in this feature, this is an area that could give you a pretty tough time on your first playthrough. There's plenty of dangerous enemies milling about, and unless you employ the right strategy and know the order in which to take them out, always take the archers out first, getting through it can be a bit of a challenge. Earthen Peak, Dark Souls 2. Pyromancers, agile enemies, mimics, archers, environmental traps. If there's something in a Souls game that has ever given you any trouble, chances are you'll run into it in Earthen Peak. While all by their lonesome, these things can be easy to deal with practice and experience at least. Earthen Peak throws all of them at you, making it a true test of your skills. That final boss fight against Mytha, the Baneful Queen, is no cakewalk either, especially if you haven't burned down the windmill and have to fight her in an area riddled with poison. Shrine of Amana, Dark Souls 2. Back when Dark Souls 2 first launched, the Shrine of Amana was frustratingly broken. Not game-breakingly so, but enough to make you rip your hair out. The area was poorly lit, which could make you fall to your death. The bottom level was flooded with water, which made dodging harder, while there were enemies all around who could attack from more than just decent range. In its current state, this is much easier to navigate, but we'll never be able to put the original state of the area out of our minds. No Man's Wharf, Dark Souls 2. Another area shrouded in shadow. If you enter No Man's Wharf, bring a torch. This is a pretty big area, one of the biggest in Dark Souls 2, and full of a higher than usual amount of enemies, especially Darkstalkers, while there's also quite a few bonfires, making every trek through this area a huge risk. Beyond your torch, bring multiple weapons and the means to repair them, or you might not be able to make it through. Ashina Castle, Rooftops, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. Ashina Castle is a pretty huge place, but what we're talking about here specifically is the rooftops. Those damn rooftops. You all know what we're talking about. Traversing from rooftop to rooftop is cool and all, but this is an area that's crawling with nightjar enemies, who can be an absolute pain if you engage them in combat, especially when they come at you with flaming swords. And then there are those flying nightjar ninjas that scream their lungs out while they dive bomb at you from out of nowhere. Screw those guys. Duke's Archives, Dark Souls. Ah, a library, a place of peace and quiet and knowledge, right? Well, not really. Duke's Archives is a place to obtain some cool weapons and magic ember and learn some pretty cool, effective crystal spells. But you earn that by passing some pretty tall hurdles. The area is riddled with undead crystal soldiers of every variety, be it knights or swordsmen or archers, and taking them down is no easy task, especially if they gang up on you, and the serpent soldiers guarding the prison are no pushovers either. Then there's Seath the Scaleless, the titular duke, who can be a tricky boss when you encounter him for the very first time. Ringed City, Dark Souls 3. The last time we saw new content from this great series was with Dark Souls 3's Ringed City DLC, and what a way it was to say farewell, if it is indeed farewell. The Ringed City is just as dangerous as it is beautiful, teeming with archers, housing 4 bosses, throwing enemies at you that can do massive damage and also shoot lasers. There's no shortage of things that can squash you like a bug in this area. Sunken Valley, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. Also, one of the later areas of the game, Sunken Valley by itself doesn't present anything that's too challenging or anything that feels like it comes out of nowhere, but the way it ends is enough to make you want to rage quit. We're speaking, of course, about the Guardian Ape, an absolute monster who's also one of the toughest bosses in the entire game. With a veritable arsenal of multiple moves that can kill you in an instant, the Guardian Ape can be a nightmare even at the best of times. Not to mention, there's that second phase of the fight which just feels like icing on the cake. You know, if that cake was made of rocks and the icing was an even bigger cake, only this one made of lava. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.